Hello, welcome everyone, and thank you for being here and joining us this afternoon. I'm Deb Bryant, and I'm the CEO of YWCA Metro Vancouver, and I'm really excited for this event today. We will be hearing from two leaders and two leading feminists, Elisha Rhodes and Maya Roy, and they're here to talk with me about what they see for the future of feminism. But first, and out of respect for the grief for the 215 unmarked burial sites that were confirmed at the Kamloops Indian Residential School, we've opted to acknowledge the land and to open this event ourselves rather than asking our Indigenous relations to do that for us. So to that, YWCA Metro Vancouver operates on the territories of the Squamish, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Musqueam nations. We also acknowledge the unceded territories of the Semiahmoo and the Stolo people, including the Kikite, Kwantlen, Katsi, Kwekwetlam nations, as well as the treaty lands of the Tsawwassen Nation. And I'm personally coming to you today from the beautiful shores of what is now known as English Bay in Vancouver. And these are the traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples. As we get started, I also just want to take a moment to recognize the horrific attack on the Afzaal family in London, Ontario last week, who were violently targeted because of their faith. And in these respects, it really is a deeply sad time. Maybe it's time to slow down, to be honest, and to hold space, a little bit of space for both grief and healing. And also to take meaningful action as individuals, in our organizations, in our commitment to truth and reconciliation and racial equity and justice. So please pause for just a moment with me and reflect on these losses and what it could mean for our actions. Thank you. So this is a time of great change and learning, and I'm an optimist, and I feel very optimistic today, especially in the company of the guests we have on our panel. Our work as feminists and as change makers has led to many good things. We see some signs of this progress around us every day, women in senior political leadership roles. And I'm thinking of Kamala Harris and Chrystia Freeland as examples in the two nations who have YWCA representation here today. There's been public policy advances that really reflect the needs and the realities of women, some of which the YWCAs internationally have really put on the front burner with governments. There's wide acknowledgement of the disproportionate impact of the pandemic on women. These advances and many others have really been hard won. They're still precarious in my opinion. But while this progress has been good, worth noting and worth celebrating, I also know that right now we are being called on to reflect on where we stand in our feminism and in our pursuit of gender equity. To consider the progress we've made and where we may have lost sight of the fact that many of the gains that we mark for women have not been realized for all women. That while progress has been made for some of us, we have left others behind. This can be hard to see. For women like me in particular, it can be tough to name, it can be tough to pause, just as we are marking progress and ask, is there space for Indigenous women, for Black women, for people of color? Have we looked at whether we are truly gender inclusive? Have women with privilege like myself been able to acknowledge that privilege and make room for other voices? There is so much more that the movement embodies than just equality for the sexes, measured in pay equity, for example, or access to the C-suite or the board table. And all these are important markers, and to the extent that they have been achieved, have been hard won. But feminism really is about rights and justice and beyond those economic markers. When I first stepped into social justice work decades ago, we were a mix of passionate and frankly fed up people of all races, ages, abilities. The challenges that I think some of those early radical feminists made were inherently radical. There was room for voices of queer folks, disabled and mislabeled folks of all kinds. We didn't call it intersectional in those days, but it was, in my experience, and it was a really wonderful, rich place to be connected with social change. So that term, intersectionality, was first coined in, I think, 1989 by Kimberly Crenshaw. She's a Black American scholar and activist, a brilliant woman. And once she defined that concept, we had a solid platform from which to really articulate and criticize the distribution of wealth and power. It's been a really important intellectual advance, I think, for our movement. But progress in the movement still has largely become linked to economic markers, as I said before, things like the painfully slow narrowing of the pay gap, more opportunities for women in male-dominated sectors. But many of these advances, I think, suited mainstream thinking and in many ways continued to protect a part of the status quo. I know these wins were important, but power structures have been largely left in place, and the diversity of voices that I experienced as a young activist have been sidelined over time. So today I am so excited that ground is being reclaimed. People are again talking about feminism as a position, an identity, and a movement. Space is being created and indeed demanded so that people can, of all identities, can stake their claim to freedom from discrimination. We owe this energy to all the justice and freedom fighters of the past, and more recently to those who have challenged and expanded our thinking. And I'm thinking of the Me Too movement, Black Lives Matter, Idle No More, climate change activists, Gen Z, and so many more voices that are being raised up right now. It takes all of us, especially those in a place of privilege, to ask the question, who benefits from existing social structures and why? And if our vision is to really achieve equity and justice, what's stopping us? What barriers in our own organizations, our own thinking, and our own movement block that vision from us? So this is our vision as an organization. If this is our vision as an organization, we also need to look at our own unconscious biases, the way we have adopted colonial practices. What are the opportunities to note, not only to critique external systems, but within our organizations and across the YWCA as a whole and the feminist movement? And so to answer these questions and more, I am delighted to have the chance to speak with two changemakers in the YWCA movement. I welcome Elisha Rhodes. Elisha is the Interim CEO and COO at YWCA USA, and Maya Roy, who is CEO at YWCA Canada. And I do, before I bring Elisha and Maya onto the screen, I do want to acknowledge that our board member, Diane Sparrow, here at Metro Vancouver, was originally scheduled to moderate our panel, but unfortunately, Diane isn't available today, so I have that pleasure. So welcome, Elisha and Maya. Yes, hi, good to see you. So Maya and Elisha, first I'd like to hear from both of you. You've heard from me a little bit on how you define feminism based on your work and your personal experience. Maya, can I start with you?
Yeah, no, thank you. It was a really interesting question to think about, I think, especially after what's been a very difficult 16 months. We know the pandemic is just basically exposing what was already broken in society. But as you pointed out, with, for example, our Indigenous colleagues and community partners have been telling us for years that children were going to these residential schools and essentially not coming back. I think how I define it for myself personally is it has to have an impact. It has to have an impact on my day-to-day life, on my relationships. But I think also to be able to see some change and being cautiously optimistic for some hope. The current global reckoning that I'm seeing right now around racism with respects to uprooting anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism, and general systemic racism. Personally, I find it really exciting, but it's also really tiring. It can be exhausting, especially as a leader. I know for many of us as racialized community members, we've made that agreement essentially to not code switch anymore. But a lot of the discussions that are happening right now, we've been having those conversations with each other for decades, if not centuries, talking about colonialism, talking about the impact. But I absolutely see a role for the YWCA, and that's also why I'm really excited that Elisha is here today, because the work that YWCA USA has done around racial justice over the past decade, I think really gives us a way forward here in YWCA Canada. But also what's been a particularly difficult time as we're seeing sort of Trump transition out and what that means for the future.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Maya, and thanks for acknowledging the challenges of the last year and a half or so, layered on top of the historical challenges that that you struggle with and many folks struggle with. So, Elisha, what about you? How would you define feminism?
Thank you so much, and thanks for having me. And before I get started, I just want to take some time to just lift up the Indigenous community and just make some space to recognize that this is an extremely hard time to have this conversation, and it can further either traumatize or trigger some emotions and some discomfort, and allow folks the space and just acknowledge that these conversations are hard because we're in a moment in time where we're trying to navigate this space, but these are also, this is our lives. This is the life that we live as people of color. So having to lead in these spaces and stand up, move this work forward, and then still have to live within these spaces is something, as Maya said, is hard. And I just want to make space for that as we enter into this conversation. For me personally, it is really hard, and there is a level of vulnerability that I have to bring to these conversations. So I just want to be really honest about that. And there is also a level of discomfort that sometimes come out of these conversations if we're going to actually be honest and hopefully come together in solidarity to move our work forward. So thank you again for having me. And I truly hope that in this time together that we can grow together and just be stronger as a community. What feminism means to me and how I defined it, I have a love-hate relationship with it. As a Black woman, I loved feminism, and it meant a lot to me because I came from a community that didn't really embody what we know and what we understand to be full community. So to come to Washington, D.C. and be a part of the YWCA movement and be introduced to this thing called feminism and to be yay women, it was really exciting. But as I grown within the movement to just understand that as a Black woman, there really wasn't a space for me where I could be my full self without having to fight for that space, without having to continually be re-traumatized or constantly be reminded that I am the afterthought. That is something that I still struggle with, even as I sit in a place of privilege as I lead YWCA USA. I still go through that. So my love story with feminism changes day by day. I am hopeful and I'm optimistic in this moment in time because I'm in community with so many of you, and we've all made commitments to be vulnerable and to have these conversations and be transparent and to do our best to move forward. But as women of color and Black, Indigenous women of color particularly, it is really hard to be a part of a feminist movement that was not designed originally to censure us or to even think about us and what our needs are. So I am here, and feminism is what we do. But I am more focused on what does it really mean to be part of that liberation of women? What does it really mean to be part of a liberation feminist movement? And I'm hopeful that we can get there.
Thank you. And I have a follow-up question that will ask you to unpack that, Elisha, in a couple of minutes. But maybe turning to you, Maya, from your perspective, what are the most pressing challenges facing the gender equity movement, and how can the YWCA best navigate them to support women, girls, and gender diverse people?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I loved what Elisha said about liberation, and that whole idea of no one is really truly liberated, that all of our liberation is tied up in each other's stories. I think we're actually seeing that urgency right now. We know that in Canada, two of the fastest growing communities are Indigenous young people and newcomers. But as Elisha pointed out, none of the systems or the structures have been set up for us. But we can also see, basically, what I'm thinking is going to happen is, as communities start to organize and start to fight back, I've seen time and time again, especially with social movements, that we have a little bit of progress, but white supremacy has a way of pushing back, because fundamentally this is about power, and no one truly ever wants to give up power. What I am starting to see, though, for example, people with privilege are starting to also step up and use their privilege. And fundamentally, privilege is only useful in as much as what you do with it. So, for example, I was doing a course on anti-racism last week at the University of Virginia. And if I could share my experience with you as a student, because I think it also sort of ties into what Elisha was sharing. And on the first day of the course, as the African-American dean was talking about his own experiences of anti-Black racism and presenting the University of Virginia's research, clinical research on medical bias, students actually started to undermine his lecture in the chat. And I just had this moment where I thought, wow, here we are at an anti-racism training course at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville, where we all know what happened in Charlottesville a couple of years ago. And I've been with this particular leadership program for several years now, and I've never seen students actually undermine a speaker or a professor while it's happening. And that is fundamentally what anti-Black racism looks like in the workplace. His authority was being questioned. The research, the very valid clinical research on medical bias and pain for African Americans, which I've also referenced time and time again. And it was that moment where, do we choose to stay silent, or do we actually choose to disrupt and be an active bystander? So I think for me in that moment, it was, I'm here to learn, but I'm also not going to see a Black dean and the entire African-American faculty of this program be undermined, at least not on my watch. So I started pushing back in the chat. And as you can probably imagine, with the fragility, all heck broke loose, basically. When I came to the course the second morning, fully expected, also as a racialized person, I'm frequently used to being reprimanded for speaking out. I'm frequently used to being accused of misconduct or reprimanded for naming racism or naming systemic racism. And one of the things I had shared as part of this bystander intervention is part of the exhaustion for us as communities of color, and certainly can't speak on behalf of anti-Black racism, but having to continuously prove racism over and over again. There's a reason why Dr. Toni Morrison talks about the whole point of proving racism is to act as a distraction. And I actually pointed this out, that if we can't have this conversation at a course, how do we expect as leaders to actually implement the work? When I went back to the course on the second morning, I was pleasantly surprised. All of the white folks in the course had basically held their own accountable. I got there 10 minutes after the hour and it was all over. The student who was the physician who was undermining the dean had apologized. White colleagues on the course had written in saying this was unacceptable. You know, we were here to learn. And it was actually one of the few experiences I've seen where I've actually seen people actively disrupt systemic racism in a time where they could have stayed silent. So I guess what I would share is we're only going to see changes when people like you, me, everybody on this call speak out and actively disrupt when we're actually seeing systemic racism at play.
So then I think the challenge you're putting forward, Maya, if I'm hearing you right, is to call on us all to step forward, to not be silent, whether it's around gender oppression, around racial oppression, but to really use whatever position and whatever opportunity we have to step into that arena and address, and not sit back as bystanders. Yeah.
No, absolutely. I mean, YWCA USA just has so many incredible tools, like the 21-day racial justice learning challenge. I think one of the really important conversations we're going to be having internally, especially because, again, as our Indigenous colleagues have pointed out, they have been saying for centuries that children went to the schools and never came back. That reckoning is only happening now, but only for settler society. So how do we do that work? But more importantly, how do we make sure our operations don't perpetuate colonization? I know Metro Vancouver has done some incredible work around decolonization. We have colleagues like Cindy Blackstock who have talked about how do we take the truth and reconciliation calls to action and implement them in our own organizations. And when we have more Indigenous children today in foster care than at any point during the residential school system, it's actually everyday people like us saying, no, we're not here to reproduce residential schools, but we have to actively just decolonize. And what does that look like? And I'll sort of leave it there, but also happy to chat with folks offline around what that could look like.
Can I, and I know, Deb, this may be throwing your, throwing it off just a little, and, you know, I'll just ask for a little space and a little grace, because this is part of learning. And I'll go as far as to say that I'm not surprised that happened, right? And what burdens me the most in this moment, that you as a woman of color had to be the one to step up and say something, right? And I guess what I'm challenged with in this moment in time is the continual burden on women of color to have to be the one to speak up and check white supremacy, check like the outrageous like acts of anti-Black or any type of discrimination. And that's a heavy burden. And it should not be part of something that, it should not be part of our framework, right? It reminds me of after 9/11, right? As a New Yorker, see something, say something, right? Why do I have to say something, Maya? Why do you have to say something, right? White silence is just as toxic as not using your white privilege, right? That white silence is actually not using your white privilege in the betterment of society. So I guess I would challenge the systems that be to like take some accountability for white silence and placing the burden on people of color to have to be the one to step up and provide coverage for that professor, step up and provide coverage for the the API communities, the Indigenous communities, the Black communities, when we're being traumatized. I'm trying to figure out how to make it from today to tomorrow. But I also have a responsibility to speak up when the folks that hold the privilege are just silent. I'm really struggling right now and always.
And I completely agree with you, because even, the hate crime that the Afzal family that Deb mentioned at the start of this talk, I was speaking with members of that community a few months ago, including BLM London and local imams, and every single person in the community basically predicted the incident that happened last week. And I found it really interesting this morning when I woke up to the news. And again, because there's this whole Canadian outpouring around Islamophobia and hate crimes, and the local police chief literally said, again, the same police institution that is racially profiling people who look like you and me while under policing our communities and under protecting our communities, he said, oh, well, we didn't know. We don't know anything because the Muslim community won't speak to us. Well, no.
Why?
Exactly why.
Sorry.
And going back to your piece around white silence, absolutely, the burden is always placed on women of color, but I also feel like I need to take a personal responsibility. And I notice you have Cast, one of my favorite books by Isabel Wilkerson, just on your bookshelf. But we also know, folks on this call, that the level of anti-Blackness in Asian communities and how the model minority myth, if people who look like me are benefiting from anti-racism work, but still throwing Black community members under the bus, we have a lot of work to do in the feminist movement. And the feminist movement, unfortunately, is a reflection of the broader white supremacy in society.
Elisha, maybe I can turn back to you, because my next question here really is about, as the oldest and arguably one of the best known feminist organization in North America, what role do we have as YWCAs in really working in solidarity? I think you've talked about our responsibilities, and certainly as individual women, white women of privilege or white people of privilege, to step into that breach, to take the burden off folks like my colleague Maya, to be the person that always raises the issues. But as an organization, what's our role? How can we boldly and productively participate in the broader feminist movement, as well as social justice movements and anti-racism movements and that sort of thing? What do you expect out of YWCAs?
Yeah, that is a good question. And I had a very different answer before this moment in time. And, I guess what I would say is, who do you want to be in solidarity with? Mm-hmm. Right? Because if we're talking about the larger feminist movement that says, you as a woman of color, go ahead and stand up and defend another person of color, is that who you want to be in solidarity with? So I guess my first question would be, who do you want to be in solidarity with? So I think YWCA in North America and across the globe, I think that we need to do some internal work to figure out who we are and who do we want to be in solidarity with. And then we need to, after we figure that out, then we need to be really bold about that going forward, because we're at a point in time where there are certain things that just should be non-negotiable, right? I am a woman, but I cannot separate being a woman from being a Black woman, right? And I'm also not interested in conversations, or I'm not interested in standing in solidarity with any organization, whether it be another YWCA, that is going to separate being a Black woman or from being a queer Black woman, right? So I think that before we can talk about what does solidarity in the movement looks like we as YWCA, as you said, we're one of the oldest and probably the largest in the region, right? We need to figure out who we are, right? And then when we figure out who we are, then we have to figure out how are we going to align ourselves and how are we going to use our power, because there is power in numbers. And the more that we dilute who we are, the more that we're confused about who we are, the more that we pivot, right? Whether we're pivoting for funding or whether we're pivoting for popularity to get likes on Instagram, social media, however you want to slice and dice it, right? We're doing it at the detriment of the communities that we say we come to serve, right? We can no longer be a singular issue organization, right? Because we operate at the intersectionality of so many different things. I'm Black. I live in the United States. I'm an immigrant. I was born in Barbados. I can't separate that. I am a woman, right? Some of my best friends are queer, Black. They can't separate that. And I'm not interested in being in community with any feminist organization that wants to separate that. So I think that we have to do a lot of internal work, right? You know, my grandmother always said, you need to get your house in order before you go outside, right? And that's what we're doing at YWCA USA. And that's what I would challenge all of us to do in North America. Figure out who we want to be as a YWCA in North America and stand boldly in solidarity. And it's not going to be pretty. It's going to be uncomfortable, but it's necessary. Our communities need us. Like, it's life or death, literally. You know, we're not talking about, you know, whether or not we are talking about whether or not someone is going to eat. You know, there are all these fancy words like food insecurity. That's new, right? But we're literally talking about life and death of the communities that we serve at any given moment. Any one of us, people of color, cannot be here just because I'm driving while Black, just because I'm just because someone is walking while being from the Indigenous community. So I think that before we stand in solidarity with others in the social justice movement, we have to stand in solidarity with ourselves.
Thanks, Elisha. And I have to say that this conversation is brilliant. I didn't expect any less. There's just a real excitement going on in the chat feature. So I'm having a hard time not getting tied into that. So, okay, Maya, you started talking about this, but I'd really love to hear you talk a little bit more about how the YWCA movement needs to acknowledge and address our colonial history. I talked about that a bit, but how can we best act as YWCAs to support truth and reconciliation?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, thank you. I think important to repeat Elisha's point around, and I love what your grandmother said. I feel like if we can just follow what our grandmothers and aunties are telling us to do, we'd be a lot further ahead. But part of that question is, yes, who do we want to be as a federation? And when we've existed for 150 years, and many of you may or may not know this, but it was actually each Anglican parish that was asked to identify 2 women to start the local YWCA. And when we started having these conversations internally, I think it was also about realizing and committing to that we need to do the work internally first before we can start advocating for some of these policies. So for example, what does it look like to bring in historians to go through our archives? Because we very well may have participated or partnered with residential schools, again, being part of that colonial settler project. It's also very likely that we were doing this work around what does it look like to actually embed the work in terms of past, present, and future. So for example, using the OCAP data strategies. So OCAP is a way that Indigenous knowledge keepers have identified nothing without us, about us, and so starting to mainstream OCAP research principles so that we could at least start to partner with Indigenous communities. I saw that there was a question in the chat around, what does this mean for the future of feminism? Well, fundamentally, the future is here right now. As Elisha said, this is an emergency. People are dying. People who look like Elisha and myself are being stopped and killed, whether it's by police, whether they're family members looking to cross the street, even during a lot of the Black Lives Matter protests in the US and Canada. We've seen protesters being arrested. We've seen protesters and community members of color actually being shot just for doing their own activism around their civil liberties. So I think it's really important that if we're going to be feminists, we can't talk about gender-based violence if we're not actually looking at what the community needs or what the community is saying. I think for us at YWCA, because we have this legacy that we're currently looking at and exploring, we have to do the internal work and have those internal conversations. And going back to Elisha's question around why, take a look around your workplace. If you have majority Indigenous service users, why don't we have over 60, 70% Indigenous staff? Why are there no Indigenous CEOs? Up until just a year ago, I was actually the only racialized CEO in a group of 32 CEOs. And usually when I sit in meetings, I'm the only woman, the only person of color, and the only person who identifies as a feminist. So I think as we start to do that internal reckoning work, how can we shift our policies and procedures? Because fundamentally, we also know when it comes to truth and reconciliation, anti-racism training does not work. Anti-racism training is a waste of time without clear policies and enforcement. And really what communities are asking for today, what feminism is being asked to do, is to hold itself accountable internally, but also to do better so that we can continue to advocate for our communities and do that work in a different way. And part of that means, as I think Elisha and Deb, you were sharing, having some really difficult and candid conversations.
So it's really that starting with that internal work in all of these questions. That's the kind of, that's the theme, and starting with that internal work. Elisha, maybe I can ask you a kind of a more broad feminist movement question, but what does the feminist movement need to leave behind completely?
Yeah, I think that for me, from where I sit, I think that the feminist movement needs to leave behind the savior mentality. I think that the feminist movement needs to leave behind the notion of we are going to maybe center women of color. We're going to get to it, right? And truly center women of color. I think that another thing the feminist movement needs to leave behind is being a one issue movement and really operate at the intersectionality in a very sincere way. Because as Maya and Deb and so many of our comments have pointed out, we are not monolithic as women. And to reach true equality and equity, we have to be able to show up as who we are and to have a voice and to be respected. So I think that for me, there is the white savior, right? The be grateful that we've gotten you this far. Be grateful that you have certain abilities. Be grateful that, as a Black woman or as a woman of color, you can even sit here and be on this panel, because it should be a legacy moment. But this legacy that we built in the feminist movement, for me personally, I think that we would need an entire panel to discuss the sacrifice and the pain and the trauma that I've had to experience and continue to experience as part of this legacy of the feminist movement, to sit here, right, and talk about the future of feminism. So I think that what the feminist movement needs, another thing that the feminist movement needs to leave behind is just the fear of not being honest about the hurt that is still out there, that as long as we've been a feminist movement, there is still a great divide. And we've spoken a lot about ethnicity. We spoke a lot about also sexuality, but we haven't even gotten into able-bodied citizens. Mm-hmm. 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 Right? Like, that's another intersectionality, and we'll probably need another panel to talk about that, right? And I think that we just are so not comfortable addressing all of those things. But if we cannot address those things, and if we can't just leave this one issue approach as a feminist movement behind, and we'll never reach equity. So I really think that we need to, as a feminist movement, be comfortable moving away from this one issue women movement behind, and really appreciate and get to understand the different intersectionalities that we all show up as a part of.
You mentioned the piece around honesty, and there's a really important Metro Vancouver member, and was very lucky to have her on our board for many years, Kim Vanderwaard, and she always talked about, you cannot have reconciliation without truth. And I think that piece about honesty, Elisha, is really important, because if racialized women, Black women, trans women, women living with disabilities don't feel like they're a part of the movement, we won't get to that goal of gender equity. When I look at our archives, I recently found a historical document. One of our own founders at the YWCA at the time, historically, she was actually against the suffragette movement. If you look at the history between, the rivalry between YWCA and the temperance, the Christian Women's Temperance Union. So even the YWCA internally has had to make changes. But I think the moment that we're in right now is a real reckoning, where community members from who live at those different points of intersectionality that you're talking about are asking to be seen and heard, and part of our job is making sure that happens.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I agree.
Thanks, Maya. I wonder if you wanted to, because we did ask you to think about just how YWCA should be focusing in on showing up for in the fight for LGBTQ2S+ folks and rights and inclusion of that community, and how that works intersects with our work, or is the same as our work, maybe a better way to say it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also just think there's so much overlap. I have trans and non-binary and genderqueer colleagues who, we know, for example, this is Pride Month, activists like Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera, who have always interrogated gender and unpacked gender. We have 15,000 years of history on this land where Two-Spirit community members prior to contact were actually seen as leaders, and seen as medicine people, and have received a very specific set of teachings. I think internally at YWCA, again, just like with anti-Black racism and anti-Indigenous racism, a lot of work to do. One of the key ways, I think, really two pieces: taking responsibility. What does this look like? Again, how do I use my cis hetero privilege to actually get that work done? So the responsibility piece. And then the second piece is around working with our community partners and benchmarking our standards to theirs. So I'll give you a very tiny example. Sadly, it's not the revolution, but it was one way where we started partnering, for example, with a gal. And that was around language. We started working with a gal who not only did they very kindly agree to come in and do training internally, but start to shift the language of our research reports. Partnering, for example, with the Canadian campaign, No Big Deal, which has amazing toolkits and resources, which was co-created by trans youth and parents around talking about the importance of pronouns. But then also acknowledging, I think, when we've made an error or a mistake. So, for example, one of the things I didn't do today, and I'm going to change it as soon as I finish, is usually when I hop on a Zoom call, I change my name right away to show my pronouns, which, yeah, in the era of Zoom, how can I make sure consistently I do that as a habit? But then also work to mainstream that so that this is our regular practice, not that we don't stop there, that we continue to grow and do more. So I think those are a few ways, but I think how we start to think about the equity work, starting with our policies and processes, is really key. And how does it tie back to our mission? One of the things as a racialized person that's always really bugged me, a lot of the labor market access contracts we get as service providers, and being a social worker for many years, it really bugged me as a woman of color that the employment skills training programs would just say, you can do it, just apply. No, there's transphobia, there's homophobia, there's ableism, there's discrimination. So how do we do that work as YWCAs to start to think about different ways of job creation or different ways to connect women to their goals so that they can fulfill their potential? Because we know simply ticking off a few things on their resume and doing a mock interview practice so that they could get a customer service job somewhere, that fundamentally isn't our mission. But as you pointed out, Deb, we have these colonial structures, these contracts that we're working with. How do we push back? And so coaching back and educating the funders using our frontline colleagues' experiences and expertise and wisdom, I think has been really, really key around that, because we do have diverse frontline staff who are really interested in making some of those changes at a policy level.
Great, thanks. We've just got a few minutes left together. Elisha, I think you've already kind of talked about this, but I want to give you an opportunity to sum up and tell us, where does our movement need to be headed? Where should we be 10 years from now or 3 years from now?
I think where we should be 3 years from now is a united movement, really working on transformational change and not incremental. I think that we sometimes have an approach of incremental, right? Even with the suffrage movement, there wasn't, and maybe the incremental was more around like biases or rooted in white supremacy. But it was, if the white women get their rights first, then the Black women, right? That's incremental. Even today, which, is actually in a conversation with one of my colleagues, and I'm sure that a lot of you have heard about this like amazing infrastructure bill that we have circulating in the powers that be here. And infrastructure is great, and I think that infrastructure is needed. But you can have the dollars for infrastructure, but if you allocate the dollars and let's just say the stars align and the money is approved, but you don't also address the deep racial divide and racism and white supremacy, if you add 1 million jobs, equal paying jobs or well-paying jobs, but there's still unconscious bias within the hiring process Someone is not going to get the job because you're going to discriminate against that person based on the name on the application, right? So the infrastructure dollars were approved, but the person that needed it the most, they're not going to get the money because they never even got an opportunity, right, to get the job. Or the kids in school, one white kid does one thing, and he's acting out one day, and then a kid of color does the same thing, and he goes into the prison to pipeline system, right? So I am hopeful that as we progressively move towards a more just society, and I'm hopeful that as we continue to come together and we have these uncomfortable conversations, but we do it in a way that stands within our mission and within the things that we say that we come to this work to do, that we can move towards transformational change, right? And that we can truly operate at the intersectionality of gender and race, and not choose gender equality over racial justice, right? And not say we'll do racial equity work after we get equal pay. Because you can get equal pay, but if women of color can't get the jobs, equal pay is not going to mean a lot to the communities that we're trying to serve, right? So I think I'm hopeful that we could be more intersectional in 3 to 5 years.
Great. Maya, what makes you hopeful?
Probably not the best week. It's been difficult. I mean, I think when I see colleagues speak up and doing the work, that keeps me hopeful. To give you an example, watching all of our colleagues across the country doing the work around feminist economic recovery. My best friend, she has a 7-year-old and a 9-year-old. And my best friend explained to them last summer, basically, you need to email Auntie Maya every day because school is a write-off with COVID. And I've been getting not just these incredible emails from a 7 and 9-year-old who are writing their own feminist scripts around pirates and doing their own, but a really interesting form of training, because when the children in my life, and I actually have to hold myself accountable when we're, for example, talking about standards or talking about systemic anti-racism or reconciliation, fundamentally at the end of the day, I need to be able to look them in the eye. And I'll just very quickly share with you, I had actually sent them, when some of our feminist economic recovery work got into the throne speech, I sent that to them. And I also sent them Amy, one of Amy's op-eds, and said, see, you're always asking why Auntie Maya is so busy. Well, trying to keep the language clear for a 7 and a 9-year-old. I said, me and my friends, we all worked together on this piece of policy work. And I did get an email back right away, and it literally read, Dear Auntie Maya, that's awesome. XOXO, Ani and Elijah, P.S. What friends? And I was like, we worked really hard on that. Like hundreds of people across Canada worked really. So, they were completely uninterested, as they should be. But I think what does keep me hopeful is, how do we support one another? How do we uplift each other? I saw Khadija in the chat had a really great question around mentoring. And actually, Ani and Elijah have mentored me. They've given me very specific language, very specific training around making sure I'm more inclusive around gender. So for example, we say siblings instead of, using gendered language. And I think fundamentally that continuous learning, that continuous collaboration for social justice, a lot of times it means looking at, okay, what can we agree on? But who's not in the room, and why aren't they in the room? And if they're missing from the room, what are we going to do about it? Because fundamentally we are benefiting So for example, as a legacy organization, you asked me, Deb, we've received stolen land as gifts for many years. We need to do a better job of diverse hiring or having Indigenous ways of knowing and being embedded in our day-to-day operations. And all of that is going to take work, but I'm here ready to do the work and sort of roll up my sleeves with all of you and bring my best self to the table. Because as Elisha pointed out, this is an emergency, and I also know it's been a very difficult 16 months for folks, and just really want to thank all of our frontline staff who've been keeping our essential programs and services running, and also really appreciate, Deb, these really sort of tough, important questions that you and the team are asking, because if we're not continuously self-reflecting, we've seen what that path leads to, and we know what the consequences are.
And if I can just take like 2 seconds, and I was going through the chat, Deb and Maya, and I just want to recognize where I am, and the larger audience, and the Indigenous community, the Indigenous women, and what they continue to how they continue to suffer at the hands of the policies within Canada, and how sometimes, most times, they continue to be the afterthought of a lot of the policies, and not centered or not put in positions to lead and create ways and mechanisms where they can thrive on their own. So, while we, as this side of North America, we've had a lot of rhetoric around, anti-Asian hate and, anti-Blackness, etc. I would be remiss if I did not end this moment without just a recognition and appreciation for the Indigenous community and my sisters in the Indigenous community in Canada, who continue to just show up on behalf of their sisters and their family in Canada, because they continue to be marginalized pre-COVID, during COVID, and even more after COVID. So much appreciation to YWCA Canada and all of the associations for continuing to center their needs.
Thank you. Well, that's a very powerful and appropriate place for us to bring this conversation to a close. Thanks, Elisha. And thank you both. On behalf of my organization, we're so grateful that you took the time to have this important discussion. I can already see requests for the next conversation coming up in the chat, and we'll have a good look at that. A large and international audience here. I didn't get a final count, but many hundreds. So your work and your words will travel far and wide, which is pretty darn good. I guess as for the YWCA, and to just kind of bridge from both of your comments, we know we have a lot of work to do. We're in the midst of doing some of that reflection. We're 125 years old next year, and we know that there's a long history to look back on, that we've grown up alongside the Indian Act, and we know that over this period of time, through many, many forces at hand, the balance of power has been purposely kept unequal. I guess I would say that we're beginning to see that as an organization, acknowledge that, find our way forward to address that. So you folks have signaled that change has arrived, and I really thank you for that. Thank you both. Thanks for everyone who's joined us, and we'll stay in touch.
Thank you for your time, and thank you for having me today.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, Maya. Talk soon.